please. Alrighty. Thank you, everyone, for indulging me. I'm Maya Bloem. I'm a narrative designer and game writer. And today I'll be talking to you about Tracks of Thought, a game that I had the pleasure to work on, specifically reflecting on how we combined a character-driven story with integrated player personalities. So I already mentioned a little bit about myself, but you might know me from games such as Reach SOS, a mobile game, and Mailtime, which came out last year. Or maybe you know me from this entrance. So have fun with that memory. I live in Gouda with my partner Esme, who's also the creative director of Tracks of Thought. And in my free time, I do everything creative. So that's me. So Tracks of Thought itself is a narrative-driven game in which you're a little ladybug, this one specifically, not so little right now, but you're on a mysterious train. What's so mysterious about it is that everyone has forgotten something they're anxious about, including you. So in order to figure out where you're headed in life and maybe help some other people along the way, you need to figure out what's going on and get to the end of the train. So Tracks is about feeling directionless, feeling out of control, which is something, who could have guessed, people who graduated in COVID times would come up with. And it's also about conflict anxiety, and part of discovering who you are and what you want is standing up for yourself and daring to be proud of yourself. So in the game, you get matched up with one of 7 buddies, and the idea behind the buddy system is that it enlarges your conflict anxiety by giving you someone who is completely opposite to you in terms of personality. How we do this is the first section of the game is a built-in personality test where we find out what personality you have and give you someone who's completely different. And then you have to work together to complete the story. The idea is that you learn from each other's pitfalls and strengths and pick up a few things from each other in terms of approaches to conflict. So, very short timeline of the project. When I started late 2022, there was a public-facing demo, which was canon, and there was a premise for the story, and there was an idea for the ending, but the rest of it was all open, so there was a lot to be done. The first step, of course, figuring out what is the game about, what is this whole train situation, what does it mean, what are we doing with that? That's the A plot. I'll get back to that later. And after that was settled, we could start focusing on who are these buddies, what do they do, how do they complement or aggravate you, which is all the B plot, secondary story. Combining both of those into one story outline, which is essentially a list of every scene we wanted to have in the game. And then from there, it was writing and writing and writing until the game was done. And Tracks of Thought came out on 8th of June this year as a part of Summer Game Fest. So when I think back on this game, what sticks out to me as something that went well is the story structure. There's lots of different ways you can do this, and there's not necessarily any wrong answers, because writing a story can be a very intuitive process. But what I really like to do is finding sections of the game that can be regarded as a chapter. Sometimes other departments will help you out in this. For example, if there are levels, or if there are worlds, or if there are already predefined sections for some other reason, then you could already start associating themes with those sections and creating a narrative around that. So I can very much recommend doing that. A tool I really like is a video essay, I guess you could call it, before its time, called Shape of Stories by Kurt Vonnegut. And you can find it on YouTube. I would definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it already. And what it essentially tries to do is map out a story on a graph with the vertical axis being good fortune to bad fortune over the span of time. So I don't know if anyone can guess already, but this is a type of Cinderella story. So Cinderella starts out here in the negative. She's having a really bad time in living in servitude. And she gets invited to the ball, so a good thing happens. And then she gets a fairy godmother, another good thing. And then she gets a dress and a carriage and shoes and goes to the ball, living in infinite happiness, feels like, dances with the prince. But then the spell breaks, she has to come home, and everything comes tumbling down. but she's still not as sad as she was before because she has the memory of the nice thing happening, essentially. We all know how the story ends. He finds her, they get together, everyone is happy forever. That's why it continues on infinitely high. Something similar would be a type of rom-com type story, but it can really be applied to anything. Someone feels neutral, doesn't have any excitement in their life, finds something that they want and chases it, and then they feel a bit happier, but then somehow through circumstance or through their own doing, they lose that thing, and then they decide to fight to get it back. Sometimes that works, and then infinite happiness ensues. But we don't have to be so positive about things either. This is a graph of The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I only read it very recently. His life starts out not great and continues to get worse, and then he dies. So spoilers about that. So this would be something of a graph for tracks of thought. You can already tell I replaced the words from protagonist happy to protagonist sad. A little bit of a difference because I wanted to speak more to what the player is feeling rather than the events within the game, because that's eventually, the game is nothing more than what your player remembers experiencing. So this matters more to me than what exactly happens. So player character starts out in the red, isn't feeling great. Immediately things get worse. But then they meet their buddy, and then they sort of have this trials and tribulations type moment where things are hard, but it's also some successes, and things are going good, but then maybe not. This plateaus a little bit, and they sort of feel their buddy pulling away, and then something happens that sets off the player character into this downward spiral, which they reconcile, they get pulled out of, and then this wobbly line continues going on upwards. And the reason why I wanted it to be a wobbly line specifically was because I think I really like the way that addiction recovery graphs look. That's a very specific thing to call upon. But if you've ever seen an addiction recovery graph, it's going to be different for everyone, of course. But there's an upwards trend, but there are still relapses and really good days, and days where maybe nothing happens at all, things don't get better or worse. And I think that's much more true to how people experience trying to get better at something. So yeah, dealing with conflict anxiety is a muscle you have to train, and a graph would probably look like this if you're working through it. One of the hard things about integrating player and story is the more you try to define the character, which is something you need to do for a character-driven story, the less you can put the player into it, because those two are clashing. Like, if we wanted to have a really detailed backstory for our character, like, oh, they've been through this and they felt that way about it, but also the player is supposed to feel like they are this character, that's a bit tricky. So we had to keep things very vague in terms of backstory. Also, we spend the first section of the game deciding who the player is in terms of the personality categories. So we already have a little bit to go off of. And we need to also keep in mind scope and budget, because if we could make games for free, some of us would, but not this time. So we have a two-pronged approach. We read out the personality type and we reflect on it on the story, but we allow moments for the player to express their individualism through the things that they say in dialogue. So while the A-plot, so everything to do with the train mystery, is the same for all of the players, the B-plot separates the player into 7 different categories. So these words relate to what we diagnose the player being. Diagnose is a big word here. And we wanted to make them similar, so the scope would stay low, but also keep some things different and unique to each experience. So let's say we've diagnosed a particular player as being patient. One we have read out is that there are signs of them behaving empathetically or optimistically or seeing the best in others, but they also tend to push down their own feelings a little bit to make more space for other people. And if you're patient, you get matched with Selen, who is a very excitable character who always wears their heart on their sleeve and expects that others do the same. So somehow you have to collaborate. The conflict that is central is communication. The player needs to learn to open up more, and Satan needs to learn to create space for people to open up in, rather than bulldozing the conversation. And if you would have a different matchup, this would be different. Other characters might be the one bottling things up, and you might be the one bulldozing the conversation. So it's different for everyone. The idea with approaching it this way is that once the player is categorized, they experience a story which echoes something they might have experienced in their own lives, or see an example of how they could work through it with others and make more nuanced approaches to similar situations in the future. So to the dialogue part, we still want the player to express themselves, which can feel synonymous with scope creep, so we decided to map out our options here in terms of layers of effort. A low effort solution I can always recommend is allowing your player to pick their pronouns and name. Essentially, you're just swapping out variables, so it's not a very difficult thing to do. The only hurdles here is deciding which pronouns you want to include. We decided on including the top 3 here, so that's the subjective, obsessive, and possessive, because we tend to use them the most. But you might already notice the problem being if you have a they pronoun, then it's they paint, but if you have a she or he pronoun, it will be he or she paints. So the verb has to conjugate too, which is another thing you have to watch out for. Or you just formulate very specific sentences where that just doesn't come up, which is what we did. And also, some people use multiple pronouns to get by, so how do you decide which pronoun to pull upon when, and how do you make that feel logical? Which I guess is also a problem in real life. But yeah, that can be the pitfalls of this. You can make it as complex as you want. You could make a whole interesting system about it. We did it in a very low stakes way. A mid-level option would be giving moments for the player to express their opinion on something, and then finding ways to call back to that feel meaningful. For example, we might put the player character in a situation where they can express that they're really afraid of the dark. So what would be smart is then to later call upon that by putting the player character in the dark and having them react to that, essentially, and be really scared. But again, the pitfalls of this could be that if your player character is constantly going around, like, saying that they love spicy food and that their favorite color is blue, it's very gimmicky almost. So you can do this sparingly, but you can also do it in a lot of different ways. Yep. And when it comes to high effort, you can think about the way that your conversations, your dialogues are structured. When people think about a super branching dialogue where everything leads to something different, they literally think that there's going to be different content on every one of the ends here. And that's really hard to manage in terms of finishing a game and making sure that everything is equally valuable to find. What you could do instead is something that's a little bit more of a chain. So you start here, you get offered a choice, you divert into 2 options, and then you come back to the next story beat, and which can diverge again and can come back again. The problem being that you're teaching your player that their choices don't really matter because things are going to continue anyway, and you need to sort of do this a little bit sparingly or make sure that you somehow call back to the precise decisions that they made. I think it can be really draining to be repeatedly told, like, the trade is going on, whether or not you agree. So this is a bit of a weird graphic, bear with me. This could be an example of how we would structure a conversation in tracks of thought. For example, you get offered a choice, and 2 of the options lead immediately to the next story beat, but the third one might give you a little bit of a detour where you find some extra content before you continue on down the linear-ish narrative. And that section there on the right, what you could imagine with this is a sort of rabbit hole. So maybe you have a dialogue option where some seem normal and some seem a bit like, that seems like I'm gonna instigate something here. I'm gonna go down this rabbit hole here. For example, in tracks we have a very rude waiter, and then 2 of the options might be like, oh my god, I'm so sorry for existing. And then the third one might be like, well, you're not that cool either. And then that leads you down the rabbit hole where you can confirm that you want to be in the rabbit hole or not. For example, so like, oh, you want to go? And then you can say, no, I don't want to go. You get back onto the main linear line. Or you say, no, I think you're a bit mean. And then you can go further and further and make things worse and worse. And this is really fun for players to discover. It's like picking up a rock, and there's something really interesting and cool underneath. And I really like having those moments in games when I play them, so that's something I'm very conscious to include in the games that I make. As I start rounding off, I have to mention that this whole theory that we are working with rests on the fact that we assume that player behavior in the game is more or less equivalent to player behavior outside of the game. We can't accurately read out someone's personality if they are much ruder in the game than they are in real life. We didn't have a great solution for this, except for marketing the game as a personality-driven game, that it matters that you express your own personality if you want it to be accurate. And sort of informing players that this is the section where the personality test is. If you don't feel like it's accurate, feel free to play that again, and maybe something will be more true to you next time. So yeah, in a quick roundup, I recommend trying to map out your story on a graph, a la Shapes of Stories. I think it helps to get a really good grip on what your story is and how the emotional arc will go. And I also recommend being creative with how much effort and scope you want to put into integrating player personality. I think there are more options out there than we think. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And are there any questions? Speechless.
Any questions?
I don't think. Oh yeah.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, does the player ever know, like figure out what their personality type is in the game?
Did we communicate like the specific words, or?
Yeah, just like, oh, you're so humble, or whatever.
In the demo we did, because the demo was essentially only the personality test. But I'm not sure exactly. I think it's possible to see it in your save file, what words are associated. But outside of the demo, I don't think we gave them a description of like, this is who we've read you out to be, and this is what your pitfalls might be. But I'm also looking at everyone who's on the team, if this is true.
Okay, yeah, that's all. I thought it would be interesting to know if there's like a thought about that or something. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Hello.
Yeah.
So this is like specifically a game that is marketed on personality being kind of part of the experience. Is there parts of this that you take to other games that you write that maybe are more like, that don't necessarily like use this?
There was definitely an era where every project I was working on needed to have a personality test. Although I can't claim to have come up with the idea. I think it just helps. With working on a game like this, it really pushes you to figure out what makes people unique and how would they respond in very specific situations, which is definitely a great skill for a writer to take into any project. I'm not sure exactly if that was the question, but that's my close enough answer. I think there's a couple people in the back. Oh yeah, also over there.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really good.
Thank
I
you.
have a question. I'm guessing that if the game is designed for specific personalities to play a specific path, right?
Mm-hmm.
When writing for that, did you write the paths thinking, yeah, I will only write it for the people that I think are gonna play it? And if so, did you communicate it, for example, in the game, say, hey, please be very truthful about your answers because it's gonna really affect your gameplay experience?
Yeah. Let me think about that for a second. I mean, we obviously want people to be truthful. When we were writing the different arcs, we always knew there would be some overlap, right? Because they're all on the same train. There wasn't going to be like a new train car that you can only experience if you are patient, for example. There was not the money for that. So we definitely designed them to have a lot of overlap in terms of environment and characters and stuff like that. But if you go into a different playthrough, you will see that there are different ways of viewing the NPCs, for example, just because you see them through a different lens. You're friends with different people. Hang on a second. I think that's the answer. Could you repeat your question for me, please?
Oh yes, if it was communicated that they need to be really truthful because it will really affect their gameplay experience, if that's the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, I think it's front and center in our Steam page, and you wouldn't play a personality-driven game that has that signposting on without understanding that, I think. So yeah.
All right. With this being a very personality-driven game, but also a character-driven game, you mentioned like writing the B plot, the characters. How do you ensure the player will at least form a bit of an emotional connection with these characters? Because they'll have to do the entire game like
Yeah.
side by side with them.
It's very difficult. I remember when we were playtesting, there were people that obviously we designed them to be a little bit annoying because they're very different from you and they might not operate in the same way at all. So we definitely had some playtesters that were like, I can't stand this person. I don't want to talk to them at all. But I honestly think that comes down to charm of dialogue and charm of the game overall. Like, you're going to want to play the game and you want to pursue this arc and find out who this person is. So I think the rest of the game helps you through it a little bit as well, but just making them very solid characters, have solid personalities, and you can learn who they are, I think helps a lot.
We have one short question.
So I was wondering if you had any like tools, so writing tools to visualize the different paths or to easily implement them into the game.
Yeah, implementation was definitely a hurdle for this project. How we ended up doing it was we had a Google Sheet that was synced into Unity, and I would write, and then one of the other developers would sync that every so often. I wouldn't recommend doing that again unless it's completely flawless, the code. I think I would recommend using a tool that's more intended for dialogue implementation, like for example Ink or yeah, Ink.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you, everyone, for the audience. You'll be around if you have more questions.
Absolutely.
You can definitely come up to Maya.
Fine.
We will go,
No, that's
into
fine.
the break right now, and we'll see you back in about 20 minutes. So enjoy.